starting. And we're live. It is Wednesday, March 26th, the year of our Lord 2025. It is 8 o'clock a.m. Mike Pesca is having a sneezing fit. I have no dog shirt today, but I do have a dog on my shirt. And I want to talk about one of the revolutionary features. No, don't mute yourself, Mike, because I announced you were having a sneezing fit. And so the sneezing fit, like having it actually on the show now.
Yeah, it's now a character of the show. Yeah,
Yeah,
people love
exactly.
it. It's like Fonzie. It's going to take over and be the breakout character. Yeah.
So I want to talk about one of the important revolutionary features of the show, which is how the monologue of the show at the top is a total ripoff of Mike Pesca's introduction to the gist. So let's talk about the structure of the gist for a minute, where Mike Pesca says, you know, it's such and such time, and it's the gist, and then goes into a mini monologue, which is not the spiel. It's kind of a mini monologue about something, and then gets introduced into the show. Now, so this show started by ripping that off. We say, and we're live because, it's sometimes in doubt whether we're live because, the tech glitches, which are, of course, part of the show. But then we announce the time and the date with the addition of the year of our Lord, because, that's funny because I'm Jewish. And then we do a little monologue that's kind of loosely associated with the Mike Pesca pre-non-spiel monologue on the gist. And then, instead of going to what Mike does, which is on the show today, blah, 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 which he can do because he knows what's going to be on the show today, because it's probably recorded after he recorded the interview for the show today. But I actually never really know what's going to be on the show today, because this show is highly improvisational, live, and so at the end I go, I do a thing about one of, we do the cactus, you're watching Dog Shirt TV, a fucking revolution in morning television in order to piss off John Roush. And then we say, and one of the revolutionary features, and then I make up some revolutionary feature that's loosely based on the monologue. Maybe I make up another one, and there are many. And then I go to, we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have, and then the name of our guest or something about the show. But I do want to concede that it is all based on the way Mike Pesca introduced the gist. All of which to say, you are watching Dog Shirt TV. It is an effing revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features, and there are many, is that if the guest is having a sneezing fit or a coughing fit, we're actually going to ask them not to mute it because, authenticity is the game. And another one of the revolutionary features is that it's called Dog Shirt TV, but I may not be wearing a dog shirt. I may be wearing a dog on my shirt. On the show today, Mike Pesca. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Mike Pesca, who informs me he has a variety of subjects he wants to discuss, up to and including Finnish involvement in the JFK assassination. Mike, welcome back. I hope your sneezing is under control.
I often have sneezing fits, and the third most shared story on the Washington Post yesterday was what to do about loud sneezers. I'm in that category too. I understand what's the third most. You could, if you were a publication, you could always guarantee you have the fifth most shared story if you just do an annoying thing men do around the house, because that will be shared. I'll pitch this to anyone, any editor listening. Why do men always stand in your way in the kitchen? That will be the fourth most shared story on any publication.
Right.
I could preview that I'm interviewing, okay, this is just between us, a very iconic doyen of household economy, if you will. and also a friend with a notorious rapper, someone who had an IPO in her own name, and that is going to be one of the questions that I ask her.
Well, I do think that, Tom Lehrer wrote a wonderful spoof on this genre of, uh, a song that is about how annoying and what bad habits the woman has, but the man loves her anyway.
Yeah.
Um, and it contains the great line, "Her hairs in the sink have driven me to drink, but she's my girl."
Yes. This is
Um,
the, I get about a third of all songs pre like 1940 were that, your feet's too big and all that.
right. But I love you anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a little bit. A peek. Why are there are two phrases that say the same thing, but a peek under the kimono or the camel's nose under the tent. Why do we do this? I will tell you this about the show. Every show that I've ever been on, there are different blocks and different segments, and it's the A block and the B block and the C block.
Yeah, we don't do that.
Right. And so what I did was we do have blocks or segments, but early on in the gist, I said, this is our revolution. We are going to not name those blocks the A, the B, and the C. And I named them the P, the Q, the R, and the S. And the S stood for spiel. The Q was a Q&A. There used to be 2 interviews. The R was these are interesting. That was retrofitted. The P didn't really stand for anything, but to this day, we call this top of the show the P. And yesterday or 2 days ago, for the first time, my wife said, maybe you should call it something other than the P. I'm like, yeah, it's a good idea. It's too late now. We're 11 years in, 12 years in. It's the P.
Well, I am supportive of everything that breaks up the 3 even segment format, which is all, I think, based on the Slate Political Gab Fest, right? All podcasts have to be in 3 segments because once upon a time, David Plotz and Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson did it in 3 blocks. Is that?
I think that was probably dictated by the demands of creating enough inventory for ads, how many slots you want for ads, and how many ads you can hold, and you don't want to play 4 in a row, so you can play maybe 2 or 3 in a row at 2 different times.
But now every podcast that's a discussion has 3 segments.
Not mine. Not even Mad has 2. But
you're a boundary breaker. You're different. But I mean, I think it's like kind of boring that. And look, we fit into this. Rational Security easily broke down into 3 roughly even length segments. It's just it became the normal thing, and I think it's and so I'm not Dog Shirt TV. Dog Shirt TV is a monologue, an improvised monologue of indeterminate length, and then the rest of the show. And maybe if we ever have enough viewers or listeners to get advertising, we will be forced to accommodate reality. But I'm really content with that.
This is why it's a revolution. I do think the number of breaks, there's no real reason for it other than the advertising demands. I think 3 people on a panel discussion is something close to the platonic ideal. I really do. Because I've been on panel discussions. I have an ongoing thing with Josh Barrow and Megan McArdle and Ben Dreyfuss. And I think that's one person too many. Although when I'm with them, I like them all. Here's the deal. Here's the secret. I think I might be the one person too many on that one because sometimes Josh just records with the other 2. They're the mainstays, and then they include me every once in a while as the paprika in their curry, and that's fine. I like it.
See, but I think the difference is if you have more than 3, if you have 3, then you can actually do it with nobody in charge or with nobody from the audience's point of view, obviously in charge. But once you have 4, somebody has to be the moderator.
But with 3, there's always someone driving the ship, right? Doesn't Quinta drive Rational Security?
Nope, Scott Anderson does. But you're right. So somebody does drive the show.
And didn't you drive it when it was when it was the original crew, the Dream Team?
No, Shane did. See, the point is you don't notice who's
Have I ever
driving it.
listened to Rational
But
Security?
if I say, there's 5 people on the show, you know who's the host and who the guests.
Right. It is right when there's 5 people. It's a panel discussion, and the number of people on the panel are 4, not 5.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Right.
So, Mike, what is on your mind this morning?
I have a number of questions for you.
All right, let's do them.
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to answer the ones about the JFK assassination.
That's fine. Oh, I have some. Do you want me to go with my suggestions for dog names first?
Yeah, she's
Okay.
very interested. Although we may be settling on a name.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble letting go of Houthi, to be honest.
No, don't do it. You can't. So
See,
I was thinking about your problem in the dog run as you yell for Houthi.
yeah.
What you have to do is get
Do
another
people
dog.
think you're an anti-Semite or an Islamophobe?
And just the whole Yemeni community will, fracture along perhaps
Right.
sectarian lines. But what you do is you either get another dog or invent a dog named Blowfish, and then you can call out both of them, and it'll be okay.
Yeah. Hootie, Blowfish.
Yeah. I never want to be with you. I don't know. I wouldn't go with Houthi. That's cool. But then again, maybe you don't have to worry about the dog run. As Pete Hegseth said in that exchange, no one knows who the Houthis are. The only
Right.
thing, there are 2 ways to sell it. 1, Biden weak. 2, Iran backed. And by gum, didn't they sell it in that exact way right afterwards?
So
And
I wait, before we go on to other issues, I want to talk not about the text thread, but about the reaction to the text thread among the senior officials yesterday, because I was trying to think if I've ever seen anything like it, and I think the answer is no. So if you have a house with a 3-year-old in it, and the 3-year-old pees on the floor, and you confront the 3-year-old and you say, who peed on the floor? And, the 3-year-old says, mommy or something, right? Like it's a bald-faced lie, but it's a toddler, right? That's kind of what they did yesterday.
Mhm.
Yes, there's pee on the floor. Yes, there's a text thread. Yes, it's on Signal. No, Signal's not approved for classified information. No, there was no classified material on it. And I'm trying to think of a scandal where the premise of the response to the scandal was simple denial of approvable reality, not blaming somebody else except sort of Jeff Goldberg. Maybe Jeff Goldberg hacked their Signal thread with all his illustrious hacking skills. But I'm trying to think of where the response to a scandal was the sky is orange.
Yeah. And it is, I guess, in this administration. So there are a couple of threads there, and I think the flat out didn't happen, which you got elements of from Hegseth. That was closest to what you're saying. There was a flat out denial of reality, but there also were different flavors of denial and different flavors that match previous ways to spin a scandal. So under oath, Ratcliffe and Tulsi Gabbard said that there was nothing classified on the text thread. And technically, they're right. It is a question for you. Even Goldberg wasn't alleging, since classification is kind of complicated, and in a lot of ways, some of the people on the thread have declassification authority. So is it clear, was there ipso facto, not just extremely sensitive information that shouldn't have been on the thread, but do we know there was certainly classified information on the thread before it went on the thread?
So let's I don't think this question is nearly as complicated as Jeff described it on his Bulwark interview. Jeff said, caveated it by saying, I'm not a national security lawyer. Well, I'm not a national security lawyer either, but this one isn't that complicated. So first of all, there's a question of, was the document designated as classified? And here, because it's a text message, there's no classification markings, presumably. And Shane Harris actually confirmed that to me yesterday and on the Lawfare podcast. So the second question is the information in it classified? Now, there's two dimensions to that question. One is the information already designated as classified? And the answer to that question is almost certainly yes, because the material in which Hegseth was presented it, for example, whether it was in a document, a targeting package document, or the Pentagon actually works in slides. And so my guess is he was presented it in PowerPoint. Every single one of those slides will have had top secret, on the top of it. And so the information is one way or another almost certainly gleaned from documents that are classified. The second question, if not, is the information the sort of information that would typically be classified and therefore has to be treated as classified? And the answer to that question is, assuming Jeff is characterizing it in a real reasonable fashion, absolutely. It's the sort of information you will get prosecuted if you smuggle out of the Defense Department and give to the Russians, right?
Yeah.
And that you won't be able to say, well, but there was no classification markings on because I did it orally, right? And
also the phrase "smuggle out and give to the Russians" probably tends towards the classified and illegal act decision.
Well, but look, if it's I used it on purpose, right? If you smuggle out a stapler and give it to the Russians, you might be prosecuted for petty theft.
Right.
But you're not going to be prosecuted for espionage.
Unless it's a red swing line stapler, in which case maybe you could say that that's Russian to begin with. I don't know. Right. Yeah.
And
returning it home.
If you smuggle out the targeting package for the Yemen Houthi operation, here's Houthi, you're going to get prosecuted for that. So I don't think the issue is complicated. I think the issue, now there is this third question, which is, does Hegseth have the authority to declassify the material? And the answer to that question is yes. He's what's called the original classifying authority, which, he is all Defense Department classification equities are declassifiable by the defense secretary. One very good reason, by the way, why you don't put a drunk sex offender in charge of the Defense Department.
Well, the drunk, yes. The sex offender might be good at keeping secrets. But remember, he's a dry drunk. I don't know if he's a dry sex offender. But anyway.
Well, I'm just saying, many good reasons why Pete Hegseth should not be defense secretary. One of them is that he gets drunk and spills shit. And so, look, I don't doubt that he could have declassified that stuff. I would want to see the evidence that he did declassify it. Now, look, I don't think this is a prosecutable case. I'm not saying it's, I'm not saying they should all go to jail. I don't think this is a case, I know these case histories pretty well. Accidental spillages do not get prosecuted criminally. And I don't think just because I loathe and hate with the fire of 1,000 burning suns the individuals in question that we should, bend that principle for them. That said, it's not a close case whether this was a spillage of classified information.
So That's a good answer. That's as good an answer as I think you'll ever get. The last part about it not being prosecutable. Remember, I talked about Ratliff and Gabbard. Right next to them in that Senate intel hearing was Kash Patel, the guy who would ultimately have to make that decision. He's not going to make that decision, even especially if he agrees with Wittes going in. But this is just to break off a chunk of your question. You know, I've never seen anyone deny something so outright. That whole explanation, I think there's a lot of parallels to many cases where someone will seem to deny reality, but what we're really doing is perhaps muddying the waters or laying the groundwork for a defense or injecting some ambiguity. It's a little like, I think, the Trump documents case where the FBI was asking back for it. National Archives was asking back for the documents. He's not allowed to have the documents. He had the documents. Like, what are we even talking about? So it's not unprecedented. He came up with a number of answers about why he was allowed to have the documents. Bad answers, but I guess it served him.
I guess what surprised me about it is that they did it under oath in testimony.
Yeah. And flat out saying no to play that clip on my show. There was a big pause. John Ossoff said, was this I guess isn't prosecutable, but did you do anything wrong? No. No? No's not the right answer.
Was it a colossal mistake? No.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just a flip easy lie quality to it.
Yes.
That I'm not sure I've ever seen. I've certainly seen people lie in a major scandal situation,
Mm-hmm.
but I've never seen one in which the lie was so immediately provable. I mean, Jeff has these text messages. Frankly, I would be stunned if The Atlantic does not release them today. I don't think they have a conceivable basis to withhold them, you know, once the entire national security establishment has said there's nothing sensitive in there.
How do you get them? You can't take a screenshot of Signal, can you? But you can.
Yeah, sure you can.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
That seems to defeat the disappearing nature of it. I thought one of those apps, I thought that was disabled, but of course you can take a picture of it from the outside.
You can take a picture with a different phone.
Right.
There's many ways to capture it, and they will have already
go into the photomat in the safe way that he was sitting in while the Houthis were bombed.
Yeah, and they will have captured it because they will have captured it for their own records purposes, right? And so they have it. When Tim Miller yesterday asked Jeff Goldberg, are you thinking about releasing it? Jeff conceded that it was under discussion, which means they have them. So they clearly have got them. And, you know, I think they're going to end up releasing them. And what will Tulsi Gabbard say then?
Yeah, I guess the strategy is to muddy the waters and day one downplay it to the degree where you just deny it, and then hopefully you move on, or that the Trump MAGA base doesn't care. There's another point to contend with. I think part of it, I think, was stupid, not just infuriating, stupid to point out how untrustworthy and deceitful Jeff Goldberg is. That might be okay if he didn't have the goods 8 ways to Sunday. If anything, you bring into doubt how deceitful was he if you're calling him deceitful now, and he definitely has the goods on you. But there's a couple other aspects. Trump did acknowledge it when he said, no, I'm not going to fire Walls. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but didn't Trump more or less say, yeah, it's a mistake, no big deal, we got the Houthis?
Yes. And look, that may be your best defense.
He has he does have a good instinct for these things, right? Every once in a while, he will admit something. Usually it's not when it's something that goes to his core identity, when it's something that an underling has done. And I think that's the case here. Look, not ideal to have this conversation. You're right. It could have been skiffs. It could have been insecure locations. In the future, I don't know. They're pretty defiant. Maybe they'll say, this is fine, and you're being you're just being ninnies about your precious skiffs. But what really matters is what we're doing, and we're brave, and they're Iran-backed, and Biden wasn't brave, and this is the media. They're getting their their knickers in a twist over process, and we're bold. And when you're bold, this is what happens. People try to nitpick you over process.
Right. I think that is and also it's easier for him because it's not him.
Right.
Right. There's no implication that he did anything wrong here. And so he can easily say, we were doing great work. We were strong. They were weak. Iran back. And by the way, if my people screwed up a little bit in a stupid process way, I forgive them because they were doing great work.
Right. And I don't think that this is something. So my criteria is for the Democrats and the Republicans, just always ask the question. Every American evaluating this has to ask, how does this help my life? For a lot of people, their definition of that will be something stupid like owning the libs. Fine. But in most cases, how does this help my life? Getting very mad at the administration for not having good OPSEC. It's just not something that rises to the level of concern, and they don't even know who the Houthis are. I just interviewed Alex Eisenstadt, who wrote a pretty good book, very good book, with a lot of good quotes about Trump's return and rise and winning in the primaries and the general, and it's called Revenge. And as much as we know, Trump is a force of nature who's hard to contain, and that his people desperately try to tell him essentially not to break procedure and to do things in a more predictable way. He never, ever does. He can't. This is not a revelation, but the extent to which it's true is just shocking, especially after 2 assassination attempts. And he just wouldn't adhere to any protocols. He stopped golfing a little, but he just was doing things that were so dangerous, even up to that point, that the Secret Service just couldn't believe he was doing, and he never stopped. And that sort of carelessness, it just trickles down. And so it's not surprising. I mean, if this was something that would turn off voters that have been turned off long ago.
I think that's right. I also, I think one interesting question is whether, he is unmanageable, but is the combination of Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, John Ratcliffe, Tulsi Gabbard, are they equally unmanageable, or can they be trained to use the high side when discussing war plans, right? And there's a I think that's actually a little bit of a more legitimate question. They're definitely aping the unmanageable quality of the boss right now, but a few scandals will not train Trump, but it may train some of the wild things underneath them.
I guess only if it's proved that foreign intelligence has stolen the conversations. In other words, I think that if this just stays in the realm of procedure, it's not going to break through. It's not good. It makes you, who knows these things, very worried, and it should. But even in the first term, Trump was really careless compared to the OPSEC that he had with personal devices and, a number of other things. So, yeah.
All right. So I have a Pete Hegseth question for you.
Okay.
So yesterday in Hawaii, when he gets off the plane and he's asked to address this story, the first thing he does is he goes after Jeff Goldberg. And his mode of going after Jeff Goldberg, Jeff's a big boy. He doesn't need me to defend him, so I'm not going to say Jeff's not deceitful and not he's very good journalist, all that shit.
Yeah.
It's all true, but I don't give a shit. Like, Jeff's a big boy. He doesn't need my defense. All right. Here's the part that I do feel like we need to think about whether we're going to address. Exhibit number 1 in the list of Jeff Goldberg deceits is what Hegseth calls Russia hoax. And the question is, as MAGA has retconned the Russia investigation, which was not a hoax, although it had elements of error in it, as many things do, do you let them get away with it? And or do you call them on it every time and say, wait a minute, the Russia investigation wasn't a hoax, and the Atlantic doesn't have, of all the institutions that have something to apologize for in the Russia investigation, the Atlantic is not the problem here. How do you handle that in real time?
Well, how they're handling it is they're writing. Here I have some Atlantic articles. 2019, the Russia hoax is a
Thanks.
hoax.
Can I just break in with the breaking news? The Atlantic just published the texts.
All right. The Atlantic just published the text. Should we do a live reading, Mike?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll try to do my voices.
Let's hang on. Let's pull them up on screen.
Here are the attack plans that Trump advisors shared on Signal by Jeffrey Goldberg and Shane Harris.
Yeah. So let's share the screen and hang on. We're gonna bring this up, and
so
thank you very much, John Hawkinson. That is exactly the sort of audience participation that we need here. Breaking in with our breaking news. All right, do you see this, Mike?
Yeah, I got it all. I got it on my screen. They write to the CIA Office of NI, National Security Council, Department of Defense, and they write, in light of statements today from multiple administration officials, which is what we were talking about, the flat-out denial, including before the Senate Intel Committee, that the information in the signal chain about the Houthi strike is not classified and that it does not contain war plans, the Atlantic is considering publishing this entirety of the signal chain. They don't get an answer. Finally, Carolyn Levitt answers them. As we have repeatedly stated, there is no classified information transmitted in the group chat. However, as the CIA Director and National Security Advisor have both expressed today, that does not mean we encourage the release of the conversation. This was to be sick. They always include the mistakes. In like the principals committee being spelled wrong. Sorry, I should be more serious. This is intended to be an internal and private deliberation among high-level senior staff, and sensitive information was discussed. Indeed, it was. So for those reasons, yes, we object to the release. All right.
Okay, so let's break this statement down for a minute, because there are a number of factual claims in it. There was no classified information transmitted in the group chat, is the first one. And that, so internal and private deliberation among senior staff. So that is a claim of, basically pre-decisional deliberative process, not of sensitivity of the information. But here, it says sensitive information was discussed, which is a really interesting, so they seem to be saying it was sensitive but unclassified, which is a really interesting formulation. Okay, let's go through it.
Yeah, and let me also say it is self-rebutting for her to say that this was intended to be an internal and private deliberation, but it was not, and that is the point. And because it wasn't a private deliberation is why this is upon us.
Right. So notice here that though Ratcliffe had said in his testimony that the officer that he named and that the Atlantic withheld the name of was not undercover and that it was completely appropriate to share her name. Jeff has said used female pronouns to describe her, so yes. I'm going to do the same. The Atlantic says we will continue. The CIA asked them nonetheless to not identify her, thus sort of contradicting Ratcliffe, and the Atlantic is honoring the CIA's request.
Now let me ask you, and if Holly were here, she would weigh in, but you know the answer to this. Is this just the version of a term of art, or is this just tradition? But really, there are some CIA officers who walk into a meeting and are in full view of the press and everyone who knows who they are, and keeping their identity a secret isn't that important. They're a staffer. It's a huge government agency. Staffers have public facing but also private facing people. But revealing her name wouldn't necessarily make a problem for her life or CIA operations.
Okay, so this is a very complicated question, right? So let's first say you, as a general matter, can't classify somebody's name, right? So Mike Pesca has a birth certificate, he has school records, his identity isn't classified. The actual, so for every CIA officer whose identity is protected, there is some unclassified record starting with their birth certificate of their name and identity and who they are. So it's not their identity that is classified. It is the fact of that identity's working for the CIA. And the and I had always thought that that was classified. John Ratcliffe seems to be saying that that's a contextual question. That's news to me. But it is true that there are different levels of protection associated, usually has to do with, are there still active sources who were that person's contacts in some previously overseas post? So it's certainly possible that there are people who are, they are still protected, but it's no longer really important, their protection. That said, my impression of that is always been that it's that's classified.
That came up in the Valerie Plame case,
Exactly.
as we remember. And right here in the Atlantic, you have that assertion, what you just said that Ratcliffe said at the hearing. He testified earlier yesterday that the officer is not undercover and that he's saying it was completely appropriate to share their name in the Signal conversation. I guess if you're treating Signal like a skiff, you would share their name. Is that right? If they were talking high side skiff properly secure,
then it is perfectly appropriate to name her. Okay. So there is nothing inappropriate about Ratcliffe identifying her to this group of people. The question is whether it's appropriate for Ratcliffe to identify her in this format.
Are any of the secure ways of communicating phone-based, mobile phone-based?
So there is such a thing as a secure phone. And, when somebody who is really critically important goes on vacation, for example, they will, give them a briefcase phone that they're supposed to keep with them at all times and that sort of thing. My impression is that you are supposed to use it really for only as long as it takes you to get to a skiff, right? And you're really not supposed to. Mobility is one of the problems with these devices, right? They can get stolen, and they're not built for that. So let's take a look at what we think is the fundamental issue. What's the most... okay, so let's... I mean, I haven't obviously read this carefully yet, but there is just no way this information is not classified. This is a launch package identifying the specific weapons and time frame. Now, does Pete Hegseth have the authority to declassify it? Of course he does. Is that a reasonable decision? Yeah, so building collapsed, positive ID. Right. There's just no, I mean, and for the Defense Department to contend that this is not classified is playing games. This is the type of information that you have classification in order to protect.
Yeah. And I mean, as a news consumer, citizen, someone who has to make decisions, this insight is fascinating. You have Vance, as described in the first article, talking about why we shouldn't do this. All we're doing is essentially helping the Europeans. 3% of U.S. trade runs through the Suez. 40% of European trade does. He's rebutted 2 or 3 texts later by Ratcliffe, giving him different, more accurate figures. The trade figures we have are 15% of global and 30% of container. It's difficult to break that down to the U.S. So I take it that I don't know where Vance is getting his numbers, but it seems like within what they think is the most private conversations, Vance is kind of pulling out numbers that are probably inaccurate or at least help his side the most. Walz is trying to protect him. Walz also making the case, as he says here, only the United States can do this per the president's request. This needs to be done. It's a fascinating, fascinating dynamic. It's respectful. On the one hand, I don't mind the fact that they're having these discussions. I'd also say that it makes JD Vance look like a non-hypocrite, someone who is consistent, right? I don't share his predilections or his concerns, but. And this has been true of Waltz, and this is why he's not a fan. That's why the Bannon wing doesn't like him, and why I was wondering if he would be jettisoned based on everything that happened, because his power base maybe isn't as strong as some of the other ones. Waltz, the guy who screwed up and invited Jeffrey Goldberg in, is making the best points in this argument, and we get to see it. He's making the best points well, I think. So, just fascinating.
I also want to say that, this exchange also harkens back to something that Jim Comey expressed shock about in May of 2017, which is that when he first goes to brief Trump and his top aides on the Steele dossier and Russia investigation, the first thing they do is talk about the domestic politics of it, which, he says in Democratic and Republican administrations, he has never seen the national security team ever do before, and that he was very shocked by. Here, they're doing exactly the same thing, right? They're literally launching airstrikes and talking about the munitions that are going up, and they're talking about the key thing is to remember Biden weak, right? Not like our people are in the field, is this going to be effective? Not, but remembering the important stuff, right? To frame it in domestic politics. And there's something frankly disgusting about that.
Yeah, well, I think that these are the realities of when you take even a necessary military strike, there is an element in a democracy. Putin doesn't have to do this. There is an element of selling it to the public or explaining it to the public. And so it doesn't actually bother me that is tied into the realities and the urgency of doing the strikes. If I don't know, maybe you can make the case. If separate from this chain, or someone said, let's talk about the PR of this at a separate time, maybe that would seem good. But if you don't handle the public messaging, that it really does affect the military, the ability to conduct military raids, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm old-fashioned. I don't think domestic politics should feature in the military planning and execution of a national security objective. And you're aware of it, but there's something gross about saying the real enemy here is the Iranians and the Biden people. And, there's something to be said for the politics stops at the water's edge, or at least that it should, or that we should pay homage to that ideal, even as we are, I mean, I don't know. I noted, like, it bothered me when I read Jeff's original article. And it bothers me also that they're contemplating bombing the Houthis, and they're talking about sending the bill to the Europeans.
Yeah.
I mean, and they spend more time on the Europeans than they do on the Houthis, actually. Um, and I don't know. I think, your domestic political opponents and your trade wars shouldn't be what's on your mind at the moment that the Principles Committee is actually launching attacks on a military target. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I've never seen the transcripts of a principals committee.
Neither have I.
So I don't know if that sort of thing comes up. The sheer tonnage of the conversation, and I scanned through this and read it as you were talking. Most of the reason that the Europeans were addressed were because of J.D. Vance's objections, and he kind of was injecting that whole idea at the last minute, trying to say, let's not do this, let's wait a month. And it seems like everyone else on the chain, Waltz, Hegseth, and then definitively Stephen Miller, who I described as like a Tom Hagen type figure, saying, I represent one client and he needs to hear bad news immediately.
Did the others wake up with a horse head in their bed?
They did. I don't know if J.D. Vance woke up with a horse head or a cat's head or whatever.
All right, so I got
there.
Serious question.
But the point
you.
is that I do think that when you, in a democracy, when you take a military action, a big part of it is, and how do we explain this to the American people? And if it goes bad, what's our justification? What's our justification to the people is sort of a proxy for what's our justification to itself. Biden weak is a selling point. But the second part, Iran backed, is part of the reason why they're striking the Houthis.
Well, and it's true.
Yes.
Right. So I don't actually mind. I guess I mind they're talking about the messaging of it at all, but I don't mind. Look, how you talk about your military enemy, that doesn't bother me very much. How you talk about your domestic political opponents in a democracy and your allies bothers me a lot.
Yeah.
All right. I have
wait. I just want to say one thing, which is that most of that was directed at Vance. And I think talking, not just convincing Vance about the Europeans, why is Biden's weakness so prominent? I think that's a point that could convince Vance. So all the stuff you're talking about, I can't believe it's in this conversation, is because of J.D. Vance.
Right.
An important point to remember.
All right. So I want to ask how this is going to play today. Is the story today going to be Atlantic reveals lying sacks of shit at senior levels of administration? Or is the story going to be, wait, is this really classified as a technical matter? Or is the story going to be administration, Atlantic shows what administration was talking about? Like, how is this going to play?
Oh, I think in the among the people who are already gobsmacked that Ratcliffe was saying, no, there's no mistakes, this will be more hair on fire. But I think it gives a lot of ammunition. The right wing, the MAGA world has to have something to hang on to. And today, Jeffrey Goldberg seems like will be portrayed as less of a patriot than yesterday, because here's what Ben Shapiro is going to say, I predict. Remember yesterday when we were all, and I called Jeffrey Goldberg a patriot and a hero for withholding the information that was very important to withhold? Well, today, because his ego was bruised, he put it all out there. And now we're getting into exactly what he said he wouldn't do yesterday, which is jeopardize operational security and give away war plans. I mean, that's not true. He still didn't give away the name of the CIA officer, and that will be the counterpoint. But the right, Charlie Kirk's going to have a lot to work with, a lot more to work with.
Are they? So, I thought about this yesterday before I wrote my column calling on them to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me they cannot be more Catholic than the Pope on the question of what is sensitive and classified information. And if the administration doesn't want it out there, they gotta say it's classified. I don't understand how you can criticize Jeff Goldberg for releasing conceitedly unclassified information.
Well, it will be because, there are many strains of MAGA world, and some are whatever Trump says is true or whatever the officials say are true. Trump is no longer saying that it's not true. I just think this opens up to people who don't really understand what's going on a little more room to criticize Jeff Goldberg. Once you make it about Jeff Goldberg, once you could change the conversation to, oh, those off the record conversations about things that Trump said about U.S. servicemen being suckers, that was all a lie the whole time. This is the guy who lies. This is a guy who took a victory lap. And now today, he just couldn't withhold. Sensitive information, admittedly sensitive information. What the government is telling you is sensitive information. He had to put it out there. Jeff Goldberg isn't a good guy. He's an egotist. I don't believe, more than not believe any of that. I'm totally with you. I just know how these things work, and I know what they're going to say.
Well, I agree with you that that's what they're likely to say, but let me just make the case that I made in my column yesterday. And first of all, something I didn't say in the column, I'm not sure that any of that stuff is that sensitive after the fact. And I asked Shane about this in my interview with him yesterday. And he conceded that the sensitivity of the material comes way down after the raid is executed. Those issues are big deals when planes are in the air,
Right.
and they're definitely still classified. They're definitely still sensitive, but they're less sensitive when you don't have people in the air. But my main point is, it is not the job of the Atlantic Monthly, or the Atlantic Hourly, as we now call it, to protect the government from its own choices and incompetence. And that is not the role of the press. And we had a situation here in which the Atlantic tried to do what journalists, when they're behaving responsibly, do, which is balance the news value of their material with the national security equities that may involve human lives, that may involve critical defense capabilities and modalities and targeting information and all that stuff. And the government responded by using the Atlantic's willingness to do that to lie with impunity. And I don't think a newspaper or a magazine can ever put itself in the position in which it is letting itself be used that way. That is sitting on information that the government claims is non-sensitive and doesn't do the things that the magazine claims it did. Once they do that, they're calling your bluff and you have to release it. And that's what happened today. And I don't think they are to be criticized for that. I think they did everything right here. And the administration said, fuck you.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I'm predicting. Mine's more predictive than normative. I totally agree with that. And you're totally right that once it's happened, it's much less sensitive. It's extremely less sensitive. I mean, the Houthis aren't sophisticated in terms of getting their people potable water, but they understand missiles. They understand munitions. They know what kind of bombs dropped on their heads. They could pick up the shrapnel and say, oh, that is a Tomahawk. It doesn't really change anything once they've been bombed. Can I ask you a different question?
Yeah.
Do you believe, is there something to, I don't want to get into feckless or not brave, and I know there are considerations, but were you a little surprised that the Houthis weren't being hit harder by the United States during the Biden administration? Because I was.
So I was, and I do think, one thing that it is very fair to the Biden week stuff. I don't like to generalize it, but the response on the Houthis, the response not just on the Houthis, but on Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, they've been attacking U.S. service personnel. And I do think U.S. response on certain Iranian proxies some of the time has been feckless. And I do think Joe Biden deserves some criticism for it. And two, if you narrowed this issue to, am I glad that the Trump administration is being more aggressive about dealing with the Houthis than the Biden administration was? And if we limited the question to this, would I praise them for it despite myself? The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we should be leaving it to the Israelis to deal with, who don't actually have the capability to
they
reach
can't
the
they don't
Houthis
have,
in a sustained way. If you
they don't
look
have
at a map,
aircraft
this
carriers.
is
You have to
farther
do-
away from Israel than they normally go. They don't have great intelligence on them.
There was the air-sea combination that they don't have, that capacity. And an important point is, I believe that Jeffrey Goldberg agrees with us more or less. Can you imagine if a journalist of a different opinion who defined journalism differently than Jeffrey Goldberg does, which is pretty much in the exact opposite way that the administration describes him, if that person were in the chat, they could have thought that they were doing not only the good thing for themselves, not only the right thing for information, but the right thing for the world to stop this attack. There are many self-defined journalists out there who would have done that.
So this is an extremely important point. And I want to say, I've never sat down and had a process tracing conversation with Jeff Goldberg to figure out what his national security views are. But his national security views are very similar to mine, right? There's a reason why The Atlantic and Lawfare work together on a whole lot of stuff, why there's a bunch of writers who publish in both places, like me and Quinta and, Paul Rosenzweig. And that's because Jeff is, he does not see, he's not a Glenn Greenwald figure, right? And so imagine that somebody who had a very adversarial view of national security, a very, either far left or far right, depending on your perspective, view
right, a
of
J.D. Vance acolyte who totally agreed, why are we doing this for the Europeans? Yeah.
Exactly. Imagine you had somebody like that who had been accidentally Glenn Greenwald or Matt Taibbi or, or
Ryan Grimm,
any of 30 people for The Intercept who gets accidentally put in this thing. You would have had this released in real time.
Or imagine if it wasn't Mike Waltz's, but J.D. Vance's screw up that invited a journalist in that is in his world. That's the right-wing version of it. Yeah.
Right. And so somebody's saying in the chat, activist journalism. I don't even think it needs to be activist journalism, just a more adversarial understanding and a less solicitous view of U.S. national security interests. Let me speak personally. I do not publish classified information on Lawfare. Full stop. No, there are no exceptions to that. Some people think that is very inappropriate. Now, if you have somebody who thinks, wow, the role is to get as much information out there about what your government is doing in as timely a way as possible, irrespective of the consequences, you would have had a very different outcome here.
Yeah. Cy Hirsch, not today's Cy Hirsch, but the number one best known national security adjacent reporter. I don't want to denigrate anyone, but there's a whole strain of people who would have published it, would have been celebrated. They would have thought that they were doing the good and ethical thing. That's important.
So Fred says in the chat, Jeff needs an airtight argument as to why he didn't think it was justified to release all of it yesterday, but today he changed his mind. I'm not sure he's made that argument convincingly. So I think the argument is in the article. It's not framed as an argument, which is that yesterday when he was asked this question, he and Shane had not yet gone to the administration and said, in light of what you say, are you really saying that there's no classified material in here? And if so, what's your case that we shouldn't run it?
Yeah.
And by the evening, they got an answer to that question, which is the the administration's position really is that this is unclassified, and that the only reason they shouldn't run it is because it's in some sense sensitive and pre-decisional. Well, journalists don't withhold stuff because it's in some generic sense sensitive but unclassified, and because it's a private conversation. That's called being newsworthy. And so once the administration said, yeah, we have an objection to your publishing this, but it's not that it's classified, it's that it's a really frickin' hot story.
Yeah.
Then they have to go ahead and publish it. And
Here's
I think that is a difference from yesterday to today.
Yeah, here's the graph that addresses Fred's concerns. The statements made by Hegseth, Gabbard, Ratcliffe, and Trump, combined with the assertions made by numerous administration officials that we are lying about the contents of the signal texts, have led us to believe that people should see the texts in order to reach their own conclusions. There is a clear public interest in disclosing the sort of information that Trump advisors included in non-secure communication channels, especially because senior administration officials are attempting to downplay the significance of the messages that we share. That last part is the difference post-publication to pre-publication. That's it. That's the justification.
So, all right, we got to stop. But I just want to say one thing further in praise of The Atlantic, which is news organizations, please, in the future, break your news in the 8 o'clock hour when I have Mike Pesca on, because this was seriously fun, guys. And I like having the real-time live reading thing going on. I like the having the Greek chorus bring this to our attention. I like the fact that, you know, I talked to Shane yesterday, so I had a little tea on it myself. So yeah, we're doing this again. Mike, it's great to see you. Come back anytime with or without an invitation. And folks, you know, keep the faith. Remember that by this time tomorrow, I think Houthi PC Small Group will probably have her formal name. Not sure about that, but we're getting there. See you tomorrow.